Okay, in our last section of our first module, we're going to talk about theories of language acquisition. And I know for some people, the theoretical basis of that underlies things that we learn is less interesting than the factual or conceptual or clinically relevant information. But I think theories of language acquisition are really important, and I think that there is no right or wrong answer about what you believe. I always encourage students to review the theories of language acquisition and to come up with your own set of beliefs based on all of these different theories. I think it's important to know what you believe, because when you think about providing language intervention, you may do things differently based on whether you think that children learn language from a behavioral perspective or from a socially driven social interaction perspective. What you believe will definitely influence what you actually do clinically. So it's definitely relevant to us as speech-language pathologists. And so the study of language has certainly been completed for a long time, and we are not the only discipline by any means to investigate language development. Clinical psychologists, linguists, developmental psychologists are all people who also spend time studying language, English as a second language, that whole community of people. And so there's lots of research out there about how things evolve and grow that's definitely not produced by speech-language pathologists. And as I just mentioned, it's just important to be aware of these very theories and important to develop your own theoretical perspective. And I can promise you that on the final exam, there will definitely be a question that asks you, what is your theoretical belief about how children learn language, and please provide some evidence to support it. Because just saying, I believe blank because I, babysat and that's what I thought of, doesn't really provide evidence for that belief system. You want to be able to substantiate, say that you're a behaviorist because you've seen opportunities where children have been reinforced for their language and actually develop language at a higher rate. So it's important to both have a belief system and be able to back that up with some actual evidence, okay? And so when we think about what a theory is, it just provides an explanation of a phenomena. People talk about it as a hypothetical set of facts, principles, or circumstances, and plausible or scientifically acceptable principles to explain a phenomena. So for something like language that's internally, developed inside the brain, we're not going to be able to find the same kinds of evidence as we might be able to with a very different kind of scientific pursuit. We're going to have a lot of hypotheses and look at the evidence of what actually occurs in development and try and make those connections to be able to substantiate an individual theory. But it's important to know what makes a good theory. And so if you have a good theory, it is something that can account for behaviors that are observed. So you can't have something that's occurring that the theory can't explain, because then it's no longer a good theory. One of the complexities with language development is that it has to be able to account for development across domains and areas. And you'll see as we get a little bit further into talking about language theories, some are really good for explaining word learning, or some are really good for explaining syntax development, but there aren't very many that really can explain across the different components of language. Theories have to be able to explain what happens in typical development as well as atypical. And so if we believe that, say, children are reinforced for learning language, and that's a behavioral perspective, what does that look like when we talk about children who have specific language impairments or developmental delays? And so whatever happens, whatever theory you think of and subscribe to, it needs to be able to account for all kinds of development. And then a theory should also be able to be possibly to be tested. And so there needs to be some way to be able to measure the authenticity of a theory that is used. So those are just some variables of what makes a good theory. And so in our theoretical conversations, we're going to talk about a continuum of theories, and they range from nativism to empiricism. And when we're talking about nativism, we're talking about, definitely one side. And theories that subscribe or align with a nativist perspective believe that children are thought to be born knowing language. And not that they're born with, obviously, the ability to speak any given language from birth without any kind of environmental input, but that all of the core structures and functionings and systems and so on are present when a child is born, and that language is considered really to be a part of the child's genetic makeup. So there's some things that the environment does to sort of trigger the unfolding of that language, but really everything they have, they come to the table with from a genetic perspective. And the opposite end of that continuum would be empiricism, where this belief structure would align with ideas that children are born with none of the knowledge that they need. And it's really through children's language ability, it's really through children's experiences with their environment that they're able to learn language. And so it's all about sort of, you can compare it to that nature versus nurture one. Born with all of these skills, where in the other end it's really about all the experiences that you have. So let's talk, in the beginning we can talk about behaviors theory, and behaviors theory is probably one that most people are familiar with just by spending time in, undergraduate psychology classes. And so B.F. Skinner is the person who has been most noted for conceptualizing and providing information about behaviors theory. And in this theory, language is learned really by a stimulus and response. So something happens, a child does something, and there's some sort of response in the environment, and that's how language is acquired. So from this perspective, Okay, continuing with this conversation. So language is learned by stimulus response. And so basically what we're talking about here is that model is provided for a child. Like you might say, mama, hi, mama, say mama. And a child imitates that response. And that child is reinforced. And it is that reinforcement that provides the opportunity for a behavior to be learned. So in these behaviors theory, language is no different than a behavior like learning to play tennis or any kind of motor activity, or learning, I'm trying to think of some other examples. Any kind of learning that you may do is consistent with this idea of using a behaviors theory to learn language. And so chaining and shaping suggests that at first a child may only be able to give a m sound or ma sound when they're trying to say mama. We reinforce that, and then over time we're slowly upping the ante about what is expected. So this idea of verbal behavior is really important, that it is a behavior, and that's really what's at play, that verbal language is no different than any other kind of a behavior. And in this theory, still biological variables account for something. So it's not to say that biology isn't present whatsoever. They talk about it as the nature of the species. There's still a relevant component for the biology of, having a human, but it's all of the behavioral responses that make language learned. This is sort of more of the same. Language is another behavior. Children search for observable environmental conditions. And so behaviors theory do not support the idea of internal structures in the same way that a linguist would. But again, that the child is rewarded for speaking, and that's what makes the behavior increase. So supports for the behaviors theory really reflect ideas like there are natural consequences that serve as reinforcement. So lots of behavior occurs, attention is provided, and that behavior is likely to increase. So we definitely have data that would suggest that behavioral stimulus reinforcement definitely increases the probability of a behavior occurring in lots of different ways. And we also know that there's a lot of successful language interventions that are based on a stimulus response and reinforcement. And so lots of what we do with articulation intervention, we have the child to say a sound, we give them stickers or stars or whatever it may be, and we see success in their increased behavior. Verbal behavior intervention for students with autism certainly is successful in increasing verbal behavior. And we know that studies of adults, when there's words that are paired with shocks, that there's a reinforcement there, that they will have a negative response to that word based on that reinforcement. So again, some more data. And we also know that imitation is a real strategy that children utilize. So if imitation is a part of the behaviorist theory, certainly that's present, and it's hard to dispute that. Some of the limitations for behaviorist theories is that, parents rarely praise syntactically correct utterances. So if a child says something correct, it's not like the parent says, like, that's exactly right or good job. Early on, when a child is first producing language, certainly give lots of attention, but that's not sort of substantiated all the way through into more complex language. So that would be one of the arguments against it. Some of the other arguments are that they feel like, the models that adults give are not always great ones. And so we do lots of things where we might, instead of speaking in a whole sentence, respond with a single word. How you feeling? Good. Okay, so there's an example where it's just a very short model, and if there's lots of less than perfect models available, then how does that sort of play out in this idea of a child observing and being reinforced? A child also doesn't hear every utterance that they produce, so if it was reinforcement based on what a child is producing, it really can't explain all of the generative aspects of language. And that we certainly know that babies are predisposed to learning language. There's lots of predispositions that babies come to the world with in terms of their attention to adult faces and their knowledge of mother's voices before they're born, and stuff that we'll learn more about in our infant chapter. And so, again, that would give some more suggestion that there is something truly intrinsic and native to language learning.